Have you heard the news? It's not just men who are being radicalised these days, but the women are getting in on it too, apparently. A new trend of radical young women are taking over online spaces where they're spreading a level of hate and extremism that is an apparent match for the manosphere. And isn't that just terrifying? Isn't the internet driving a wedge between us? Can't we all just get along? So the manosphere, as I'm sure we all know, it's been subject to a lot of recent media scrutiny, from Louis Theroux's documentary to the news coverage of the Tate brothers' violent and yet vaguely homoerotic social media posturing, and their real-world sex trafficking as well, to the spate of interviews with the ever bleaker avatars of looks-maxing.
Just like happiness as an idea, like men are supposed to be happy. I don't really think.
Why are men not supposed to be happy?
Because life is hard.
Oh God, that boy is so bleak. I did a whole video about that, and then he went out and just said it, and that is just bleak. Each of these strands of the manosphere are slightly distinct and have more or less extreme manifestations, but they all share some consistent features, bound by the belief that mainstream society is a misandrous conspiracy that disadvantages men. Keep that in mind. Male supremacist groups frame contemporary gender politics as a war against men, thus subverting the genealogy of violence, and frequently engage in misogynistic abuse as well as inciting violence against women. Taking the red pill, as I'm sure we're all aware, is about waking up to the real world and seeing through the feminist conspiracy that hides the fact that men are the real victims in society. You know that post that always goes viral about those muddy men who are doing labour, and it's like, oh, women couldn't do that? First of all, the amount of women and children who are involved in global extraction is, obscene. So, not to yet fact check the misogyny, but it's always fake. But that's the kind of conspiracy dynamic that's at play.
It's interesting, all the dangerous jobs are done by men.
And I want you to keep that in mind as we're going forward, this notion that men are the real victims of society. Keep that in mind. While the softer edges of the manosphere, such as podcasts like Diary of a CEO with the perennial Huel Hucker Stephen Bartlett.
Quick word on Huel. One day in the office many years ago, a guy walked past called Michael, and he was wearing a Huel t-shirt. And I was really compelled by the logo. I just thought from a design aesthetic point of view, it was really interesting.
While they invite men into the misandrous conspiracy with a relatively anodyne, men's mental health talk, which can only effectively be countered with an entrepreneurial hustle culture, a dynamic most notably pioneered by Jordan Peterson.
Chin up, chest out, shoulders back. They make you stand like that. There's no coincidence to that, is there?
Not at all. Not at all. Well, it's a. You could say it's a dominant stance, but that's not the right way of thinking about it. Although it is a dominant stance, the reason to adopt it is not because it's a dominant stance. It's a competent stance.
These softer edges act as a radicalization pipeline where men get exposed to, and through, the interactive qualities of streaming, engage in more and more violent and extreme misogynistic acts. While the sizes of these internal communities of the manosphere wax and wane, where pickup artistry is less popular than it was before, looks maxing gains popularity, whatever. As a whole, the manosphere itself has both grown, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, and become more extreme and, crucially, more mainstreamed. And I think this mainstreaming and intensification is, linked to the fact that the rise of the manosphere is specifically reactionary. And that is internal to its logic. While the underlying conditions of the manosphere can be traced to a sort of general wearing away of masculine power within the household, as some women are able to break from direct male domination through access to the wage, the immediate sort of reactionary causes can be linked to the sort of digital mobilizations and real-world mobilizations around the pervasive violence against women, as expressed through hashtags like #MeToo and the neo-manosphere movements. And these large-scale feminist movements are framed by the manosphere as an outright war against men, requiring an extreme reaction. And what's kind of interesting is that while a lot of the media perception of the manosphere is critical, like they don't like the misogyny, it still takes as a given that they're reacting to real legitimate grievances. You know, there's apparently a real male loneliness epidemic which specifically takes the form of men not having access to women in the dating pool, and this is framed as a very, very serious issue, and one which, in the words of my friend writer Eleanor Penny, Substack and Twitter in the description, is used as a rallying cry for empathy for young men. We're invited to see young men as creatures of empathy, people who are suffering.
45% of men 18 to 25 have never approached a woman in person?
I think we have our economy is attached to one objective, and that is to evolve a new species of asocial, asexual males.
The radicalization of young men through the manosphere is seen as the result of a bum deal that these young men get at the tail end of neoliberal capitalism. They don't have economic stability, and the discourse implies that this is unique or especially extreme for young men, and these feminist movements are framing them as evil, pulling them apart from women. Sure, they may be wrong to be misogynistic or to be violently misogynistic. I don't think some of these people quite like being misogynistic as long as it's the right kind of misogyny, but the radicalization is seen as the result of something real, something serious, and something that women are often seen as responsible for. But now, finally, someone is paying attention to the radicalization of young women, and perhaps we can now approach radical young women with a similar level of empathy. Recently, the British magazine The New Statesman, known for its perverse obsession with treading a centre line across politics, has published an investigation into the apparent radicalisation of young women through TikTok and Instagram. But unlike the young men of the manosphere, these young women are being radicalised into a different, but no less scary extremism. A left-wing extremism. One that is in some way the mirror image of the violent misogyny spread by the likes of Tate. While not explicitly stated, there's an implication that the Femosphere is just as dangerous as the manosphere, and whoa! Isn't that something? Isn't that shocking? Shouldn't we be worried? No. So this is not a video about the reality of the Femosphere. This is a video about misinformation, about the misuse of data, and about the framing of women as responsible for the ills of society. Normally, I just ignore guff like this, which is, sharted over the timeline. But what caught my eye, what my eye was actually drawn towards by my friend Davil, fuck you Davil, was the response from nominal left-wing academic Dan Evans, who was impressed by the article's diagnosis of the obverse of the manosphere, inceldom, wrapped by yank Instagram ultra-liberalism idpol slop. Now, I'm not quite sure what lines Evans draws between yank Instagram ultra-liberalism idpol slop and women being frightened, tired and miserable over the constant violence they face at the hands of men. Although that is the way of reactionaries across the centre and on the left too. They say just enough to signal a dismissal of the issues they deem unimportant, whatever yank ultra-liberalism is, without, actually staking out a position which could be criticised. And indeed, implications and nudge-nudge, wink-wink gesturing plays a really central role in the non-argument of this article. Does the Femosphere being a mirror image of the manosphere make it just as bad? It's unclear, but that certainly is the implication. And I wish Evans was all I'd seen. I might still have ignored this, but soon after I saw centre-left journalist Sienna Rogers had also retweeted the article with a added jab at all these left-wing young women who want a bigger welfare state than ever but rule out having children, making that an impossibility. And then, all of a sudden, a load of right-wing, far-right and questionably reactionary figures started sharing the article as proof that radical young women are just as to blame for the divisions in society as men. Rogers' statement itself is just a repackaging of the exact kind of manosphere rhetoric that women need to be held responsible for the reproduction of society as a whole. It's women who need to learn to love men, love children, love traditional biologically grounded gender roles. It's women who are responsible, who are to blame for lonely men with no families. For the loneliness that causes the violence, it's women's fault. And it's almost beside the point, but it's just not It's just factually untrue that lower birth rates would necessarily spell the end of the welfare state. There are many ways in which welfarism can be organised and funded, even within a social democratic arrangement, from higher capital taxation, to migration, to nationalisation of and investment in key industries. Never mind that the women interviewed in this piece claim a far more radical politics, which would, I imagine, though this is never really asked of them, include a decommodification and degendering of care labour, housing, and other goods understood as being part of the welfare state. That's not really asked of these people, and, I digress. Both these expressions of adulation, from Dan Evans to Sienna Rogers, position radical young women as silly, uninformed extremists and place an undue amount of blame on their shoulders for society's ills. And this is the general thrust of the article. Ideological adherents to the political centre ground, like those at the New Statesman, are ever desperate to create a parity between parity between those to their left and the right. And here it's no different. The Femosphere is not framed as a reaction to hostility and violence faced by women. It's not a reaction to the explosion of the manosphere as an expression of that violent misogyny that underpins society, but in the words of the author, a growing number of left-wing female influencers is in some ways a mirror image of the content made by male influencers. While the toxic, often hard-right politics of the manosphere has been exhaustively documented, the new generation of female influencers are similarly radical. They are just on the other side of the political spectrum. On the internet, women and men have never been more alienated from each other. Now, you might note two things here. One, John, you just said the manosphere was a reaction to some feminist movements, so isn't this just the same? To which I would say, no. Because there is, one, almost no evidence provided that an actual sociologically defined phenomenon of the Femosphere with an analytically cohesive set of values actually exists outside the author stating that there are some influencers and some people watch feminist reels. And two, the manosphere is reacting to a perceived feminist conspiracy aiming to keep men down, which is, and it's important to say, not real. While these women are reacting to real violence and a real, increasingly mainstream and extreme phenomenon of the manosphere. The second thing you might say to me is that maybe the authors are implying that this apparent Femosphere emerges as a reaction to an increasingly extreme manosphere. And this kind of argument by implication is a common theme throughout the piece, which allows the authors to never plant their flag, never make a real argument. Ironically, another strategy pioneered by Jordan Peterson.
You're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
I don't know.
You don't know where you are right now.
But if you look at the article as a whole, as will become clear later, the authors frequently undermine the position that women are reacting to anything real in politics and are instead just silly radical girls. And so while the author plays the same game of winking implications as the likes of Dan Evans, never stating outright that this apparent Femosphere is as bad as the manosphere, the implication is clear. These are competing, comparable echo chambers.
I think men and women are looking at very, very different internets now, young men and young women. Like the women I spoke to said they were worried about what the men were looking at online. They're worried about, Andrew Tates and people like that.
Yeah.
Whereas I spoke to an influencer who would post very, very left-wing content, very sort of anti-imperialist, very pro-Palestine, very anti the government, anti-Starmer, anti-Trump, but also there is mixed in content about, and with her and people like her, about toxic masculinity, about manufactured male victimhood, things like that. It all kind of blurs into a larger online space where that has a significant antipathy towards men alongside progressive politics.
Men are producing toxic content and so are women. On the one hand, you have the violent misogynistic content of people like Andrew Tate and HS Tiki-Toki.
This woman, she might be pretty, but can she book all my flights for me? Can she do my washing? Is she flawed? Is she toxic? Is she XYZ? Is she damaged from her past? Is she caring? Can she slop it correct?
The wildly popular humiliation rituals of the young women on Fit and Fresh, or Fresh and Fit. I don't know, I don't watch this shit.
I do have a girlfriend, but she understands her place. I'm the leader, she's the follower. Yes, her opinions will be listened to some degree, but at the end of the day, this shit was created by me, It's being run by me. I'm the fucking captain. All right? That's how it goes.
Is she happy though?
Yes. Because she understands that she's able to be a woman. She knows her place.
That's perfect.
She understands that I'm the leader. And if I tell her,
a man should be a leader.
and if I tell her
agree
to
with you.
shut up, she shuts up. If I tell her, I don't want to, like, this is what it is.
And the bizarre hyper-neoliberal face-smashing SMV ascending look-smaxers. And on the other hand, you have apparent Femosphere, which spans a range of tones. Much of it reinforces this hostility towards men. There are misandrous dating coaches who urge women to reject men altogether, and more explicitly progressive content creators who cover global and domestic politics. Many of the left-wing accounts O'Brien interacted with, O'Brien being one of the influencers, were withering about men. Megan Cooper, a British trauma-informed holistic therapist, has a podcast called Higher Love, in which she discusses violence against women, quote, hypermasculinity, and quote, the ecosystem of manufactured male victimhood. On Instagram, Cooper posted about the conflicts in Iran, Palestine, Beirut, and Sudan. I don't know about you, but for the past few months, my bones have ached, she wrote in March. The viscerality of the feminine wound. O'Brien has also shared posts from Frank Riot, a female artist with long bleached blonde hair. Scroll through Riot's Instagram page and you'll see selfies of her wearing a cap, all cops are bastards, bandanas and suffragette rosettes alongside infographics about Israel's war crimes. Now, notably, since I filmed this, the host of Higher Love, the podcast mentioned above, has come out to publicly say that her work was wildly misrepresented by the New Statesman, with no effort to contact her to speak about it. She notes that of her 110 episodes, only 2 focus specifically on violence against women and girls, and the terms hypermasculinity and manufactured male victimhood were used by a male guest. The quote that is used on her bones aching and the viscerality of the feminine wound, which is framed as her response to Palestine, Beirut and Sudan in this quote, was actually originally a reflection on the publishing of the Epstein files, the most famous elite sex trafficking ring of women and girls. But using it to reflect on Beirut and Palestine is clearly an attempt to frame it as some sort of woo-woo, silly feminist reflection on the wider progressive issues for the purposes of this article. And it's notable, given what I'll talk about later regarding their use of data in this article, that they have deliberately decontextualised this woman's work to make her look silly, and that they couldn't even reliably identify the existence of a supposed Femosphere of content creators without going out of their way to be dishonest about it. This is bad. This is the deepest actual engagement with the apparent content creators of the Femosphere, and it's striking how it's essentially nothing. There's also no causal link established between such influencers and the attitudes of young women. It is just as reasonable to assume young women become influencers of this ilk because of the underlying social world they inhabit, rather than the influencers creating that world, or that what pushes young women to find that content is the misogynistic extremism of the manosphere. So when the author argues that the internet has pushed young men and women further apart, and the people they interact with on the internet reinforce their beliefs in a vicious cycle, the Femosphere both reflects young women's disaffection and perpetuates it, radicalising them further. There is, to be clear, no evidence presented to support the claim that Femosphere content is the root cause of this social division, nor is there evidence presented that women are being radicalised further by the internet. And what's kind of weirder is that throughout this article, and despite the claims of the article, there's very little actually said about the Femosphere itself. There's also nothing here which implies any comparable violence towards men, obviously, and frankly, there never will be because, the patriarchy exists. But the linking of man-hating to radical politics seems to be implying not only that these women are just as bad as the parade of barely sentient steroid golems that slobber over podcasts, Mike, but that support for Palestine is somehow also comparable to violent misogyny. I think it's important to emphasise that the manosphere is not just an online echo chamber, but a method of promoting and intensifying violence against women which maintains patriarchy. So while we can pose similar questions about the explosion of misogynistic content creators being a function of rather than a cause of misogynistic society, and I will return to this a bit later on, there's clearly an intensifying impact which has been demonstrated for the manosphere, which hasn't been demonstrated for this loose connection of female content creators labelled here as the Femosphere. The manosphere ecosystem has been causally linked to real-world violence against women. On May 23rd, 2014, 22-year-old Elliot Rogers went on a rampage where he stabbed, shot and used his vehicle to kill a total of 6 people and injure 14 others in Isla Vista, United States. On April 23rd, 2018, after posting on his Facebook page, "The Incel Rebellion has already begun," 25-year-old Alec Minassian killed 11 and injured an additional 15 people in a vehicular attack in Toronto, Canada. On August 12, 2021, 22-year-old Jake Davidson shot 7 people, killing 5 in an attack in Plymouth, the United Kingdom. These are just some of the many known instances of incel violence. Upwards of 50 deaths were attributed to incel violence in North America between 2014 and 2020. Note, of course, that this, as has been established, the manosphere has intensified and become more extreme since 2020. So take that as you will. And just to be clear, this is just a tiny slice of the constant expansive scale of violence against women which pervades society. But the content in the manosphere and the violence it produces is just one expression of how patriarchy and violence is used to maintain itself. In discussing the role of media depictions of violence against women, the Marxist feminist Veronica Gago argues that violence operates as a pedagogy of cruelty, which is inseparable from the intensification of media violence that operates by spreading that aggression against women, distributing a message and confirming a code of complicity between a mode of practicing masculinity.
What would you say is the message?
I coach boys how to make money.
Wow, this is a nice spot.
How to be outside the system. How to be proper guys.
Shut up or not.
We can easily apply this notion of a pedagogy of cruelty to the manosphere. The violence expressed by those creators and, in the case of rapists and sex traffickers like the Tates, the violence enacted by them. This violence teaches men that this behaviour isn't just acceptable but required as a functional aspect of their masculinity. The manosphere isn't just an echo chamber but a classroom for teaching masculine violence. And there is, to be clear, no analogous application of this to women because femininity is not constructed through violence towards men as such. Women are not being radicalised by feminism to murder men. I cannot express to you how little there is in this article to substantiate the argument that there is a cohesive culture of feminist content creators that could be, in an analytically reasonable sense, described as a mirror of the manosphere. Instead, what we have is vague gestures towards some young women who perhaps have some hostile views of men, views which are obviously born of the pervasive violence women face, and who often couch those views in wider radical politics. And I fundamentally don't see what could possibly be surprising about this. Even when the authors of the piece accept that what may be causing suspicion of men is the massive rates of sexual violence faced by women. They briefly gesture that 1 in 4 women have been raped or sexually assaulted in England. They immediately follow this by making a point that it's more privileged women who have the most cynical outlook towards men. Again, no strict argument is made here, and I'm sure the authors would deny it, but the implication is quite clear. These women are complaining too much. Somehow, being privileged should absolve you of fears of sexual violence, despite the fact that the vast majority of sexual violence is committed by men against their female partners within the home. This fact is conveniently left out of the narrative. Instead, the authors think it's more important to muse on the fact that radical young women wouldn't date someone with different politics. The male loneliness epidemic, again, framed as something that is women's fault. And the implication again being that male loneliness can only be understood as a lack of access to women.
45% of men 18 to 25 have never approached a woman in person?
I think we have our economy is attached to one objective, and that is to evolve a new species of asocial, asexual males.
Maybe in a world in which pedagogical violence is spread across the internet, and where being in a relationship with a man is actively dangerous, being choosy about who you date is understandable. Maybe. Just, maybe. And remember as well that an essential part of the manosphere is that there is a feminist conspiracy lying about women's oppression in order to keep men down, keep them lonely, keep them from having access to women in the home as sexual partners, servants, wives. If anything, it's the authors of this article who are here mirroring the manosphere discourse by implying that more privileged young women are in fact being unreasonable in comparison to the more truly aggrieved young men. That's mirroring the manosphere. You're doing the thing. It's again important to note, as Eleanor pointed out, that the reaction to the manosphere is to have empathy for lonely young men, while the reaction to the manosphere is to imply that privileged young women are moaning too much. But this invocation that more privileged women appear more hostile to men, and the world in general, is just one way in which data is used or misused in this piece to obscure reality and undermine young women. Now, I don't hate quant people. I don't hate quant people. I just don't respect most of them. And this article is a really good illustration as to why. So, come with me on a brief detour on how data should be used and how it should not be used. Proper quantitative research works like this. You seek an answer to a research question. You produce a data set with a sample size and breakdown which is representative of the population you seek to study. In this case, young men and young women of representative race and class makeup. You then ask them questions like, for example, do you have a positive view of men or women? What you then do is interpret that data. You situate it within a particular theoretical framework, or epistemic worldview, or whatever, and then you assess what exactly your data might be telling you. What you don't do is take all the first steps and none of the latter. You don't present your data with no analysis, or let's be honest, basic thought. You don't present your data as if your data is simply reality. Data is not truth. It's not even a snapshot of the truth. Quantitative data is notoriously difficult to translate into qualitative understandings of social attitudes because it's necessarily reductive. That doesn't mean that it's innately useless. It's often useless. But it means that it requires a lot of work to make it useful. So, for example, when this article implies that women are being more radicalized against men than vice versa, saying, quote, they also feel more negatively towards young men than young men feel about them, the authors are making an absurd, obviously misleading claim through the misapplication of data while dressing up the finding in a big fake lab coat to make it seem legitimate. The survey data asks men and women, do you have a positive or negative view of the opposite gender? And then presents, without qualification, that 72% of men say they have a positive view of women, while only 50% of women do. The nudge-nudge, wink-wink implication here is that women are being unreasonable. It's not qualified, for example, that many deeply, violently misogynistic men will say they love women. They just hate those bitch fucking whores who lie about rape and want to steal your money. They love women, though.
I love women and I actually understand them.
You think you know better than they do?
They want a guy that can lead them and dominate them.
They love women, especially those women that act right and care for them. Mummy.
But can she book all my flights for me? Can she do my washing?
And this isn't complex stuff. This is the basics of data analysis and presentation. Failing to couch your data in explanations about why it may have appeared in this way is not an exercise in scientific neutrality, but a deliberate tactic to produce certain narratives without actually having to make or defend an argument. In this case, a narrative that women are unreasonable. And this isn't the only case where the article presents data without proper explanation in order to imply an argument that is never actually stated. Elsewhere, the author argues that white women are more likely to feel the country is racist than non-white women. Okay, so while I was writing this, I was prepared to make an argument about how there are, various reasons why this might be the case. Reasons which aren't presented, which aren't analysed, but are just, the data is just presented and left there. Reasons like non-white women perhaps being more cautious about making statements about racism in Britain, because those statements can and have come back to hurt them. Think of like all the narratives of, well, if you don't like it here, why don't you go back where you came from? After some black or brown person brings up racism in the UK. Reasons like this can't be captured by simple data and would be counter to the obviously implied argument from the article that thinking Britain is racist is some sort of luxury opinion held by needlessly aggrieved middle-class champagne socialist feminists. I was going to point out that even if those rates were a perfect reflection of the reality of those views of young women, it wouldn't impact the legitimacy or truth of the statement, Britain is racist, which it is, obviously. Then I went to the data and found this, which seems to show the opposite of what the piece says. So I went to find out what happened, and according to the data lead, they had mislabeled their data in the piece and provided an update version, which does show, as the write-up says, white women indeed believe in the UK, or apparently believe in the UK to be racist at a higher rate than non-white women. Now, mix-up like this are obviously just kind of sloppy, but I took the opportunity to ask the data lead if she had any consideration as to why the survey produced the result it did. She did not reply. Instead, we just have to be happy with the overall implied argument of the piece and of reactionary responses to the piece from the likes of Dan Evans. But this isn't my final example of data misuse. In the piece, the authors continue building the image that these angry young women are needlessly slow, or, being tricked into being so by the internet. They highlight that young men are actually more likely to be unemployed than young women, yet young women are more financially cynical. Presenting this data without qualification is once again misleading and at best mirrors the actual construction of the manosphere more than the social attitudes of these young women does. While young women may be more likely to be employed, they are also, per the feminist think tank the Women's Budget Group, much more likely to work multiple jobs, a figure which has increased since 2022. They're also more likely to be on insecure work, on temporary contracts, are at particular risk of losing out on pensions, and more likely to be in customer-facing roles which also come with higher rates of sexual harassment. It's also the case that while women's participation in the labour force has rocketed over the past 40 years, they're also still most likely to be responsible for unwaged household labour. A recent report from the European Parliament found that 75% of all unwaged household labour is done by women, and this has only gotten worse since COVID. So the question of why young women may feel more financially cynical is probably not that difficult to figure out. The data write-up also makes the argument that women who spend more time online believe that the option to have an abortion is under attack in the UK, despite Parliament recently voting to decriminalise abortion up until birth. The implication is that those women are wrong and vulnerable to misinformation spread online. Perhaps the same kind of information that makes them hate men and love communism. Perhaps some sort of feminist conspiracy, maybe. Yet while abortion has recently been decriminalised for the women who have abortions in the UK, that doesn't undermine the fact that, firstly, until recently, policing of illegal abortions was becoming increasingly harsh, with several high-profile cases of abortion-related prosecutions in England. There has also been a notable increase in anti-abortion social movements funded by US money over the past few years, as well as a frenetic right-wing response to the decriminalisation of abortion, which includes claiming that the UK was going to let doctors abort babies up until birth, which is obviously, untrue, and doctors who perform abortions past 24 weeks could still be found criminally liable, which leaves the option for women seeking abortions beyond that period very limited. So the, forgive the phrase, hysterical response was a very clearly coordinated right-wing attack on abortion rights. And so while the current government has removed women from criminal liability for abortions performed outside of the existing stringent legal regulations, this has come alongside a clear attack on abortion rights from the right. And this is in the context of reform, with its various hardline anti-abortion MPs leading election polls. So to imply women who believe abortion rights are under attack in the UK are victims of misinformation is a huge leap without much explanation, and only serves to justify the overall tenor of the article that these silly champagne feminists with pink hair and bright coloured hair and nose rings are pushing feminist conspiracy theories and need to grow up and learn to love Britain and men. And so what we have here is a bunch of selective data being presented without any proper contextualization or even any attempt to actually explain what the data is capturing. Only reason this might be is to imply an argument about the young women in question. And I think I can back up this point by looking at the many occasions where they needlessly highlight the bright hair colours and piercings of the women in left-wing spaces while making veiled jabs at the concept of being non-binary. What looked like lots of bright-haired girls, though several told me politely that they were non-binary. Again, I can't identify a strict argument here, but that's weird. That's a weird thing to say. Why are you saying that? Why would you not just say lots of women and lots of non-binary people? Why, when corrected, did you say that? The overall feeling then is one of patronising disdain. And, the author of this piece, while blurring the distinction between the online cohort of Femosphere influencers and the social attitudes of young women, muses that the root of younger women's complaints didn't seem to be simply misogyny, it was far more amorphous, touching on almost everything about capitalism, about Britain, about their lives. Now, putting aside that again, the article establishes no causality, or even more generously, no real link between the Femosphere creators and the social attitudes of women. Is the Femosphere an expression of underlying features of society or a cause? How do we know who women are watching when they're spending time online? This point seems blurred. But more broadly, I'm just kind of confused about which generation of feminists didn't connect the root of misogyny to the wider social world. While Marxist feminists like Silvia Federici have for decades described capitalism as constituting a war on women, even less radical feminists have long understood misogyny or patriarchy to be an all-encompassing social phenomenon that structures the entirety of social life and is affected by matters outside of just immediate, daily misogyny that they face. There are clear feminist cases to care about Palestine or to care about Iran. There are clear elements at play there. Many of them. And they're just sort of ignored or glossed over. So who's being unreasonable here? What's the argument? Fuck. I mean, I've been ranting for a while here. Let's fucking bring it home. One thing that I think is striking about this piece is that the concept of the Femosphere pre-exists this write-up, but the pre-existing concept is almost completely at odds with the toxic, patronising hand-wringing over radical young women that this piece pushes. In 2024, The Guardian published a piece on the Femosphere, which drew on the work of Dr. Gilly Kay and the socialist feminist and family abolitionist Sophie Lewis. In this piece, Kay's work on the Femosphere is summarised, and it is far more compellingly a mirror image of the manosphere. Rather than a group of radical man-haters, Kay understands the Femosphere to be made up of a kind of reactionary, post-feminist group of women who, like the manosphere, reify traditional gender roles in conjunction with a kind of entrepreneurial consumer spirit. Men should always pursue women. Women should seek financial contributions from men, and the majority of men have no value. As Kay explains, there's a conservative embrace of traditional gender roles, which is framed within a kind of entrepreneurial spirit to get that bag, girl. Women are valued through homemaking, and in a term which should remind you of the Look Maxers, women's currency in the sexual marketplace resides in her withholding sex from men, and you diminish your value if you have casual sex. This cohort of creators are projecting a kind of post-feminism which reifies traditional gender roles within a hyper-neoliberal frame of entrepreneurial consumerism. Like the men who see the erosion of patriarchal bargain as the cause of their ills, such women see being forced into the labour market and the lack of security through patriarchy as a major harm in the contemporary era.
I used to be a feminist before I saw the effects of third wave feminism. Men are isolated and they're terrified of pursuing a woman. And this has forced women into masculine roles where they are pursuing men. I think everyone can agree that this is not natural. And it seems that there are more and more people not starting a family.
So, in this sense, it's far more accurate to understand them as a mirror of the manosphere, even if their real-world influence is undoubtedly far from comparable. And so what really justifies understanding these post-feminist creators as a mirror of the manosphere is what they tell us about the underlying patriarchal structure of neoliberal society. Since the inauguration of neoliberalism, women have been both mobilised into the workforce and shouldered with the socially reproductive burden of care labour. And this had several impacts. Mobilising ununionised women into the workforce as a reserve army undermined organised labour, which was largely masculinised, while simultaneously neutralising the growing feminist movement against the patriarchy of the family wage. Work was framed as liberating because through the wage, women could gain real independence from suffocating, violent family life. But simultaneously, neoliberalism undermined the fraying of patriarchy by privatising previously state-mediated means of social reproduction, so that women were reburdened with such duties. This naturalised and invisibilised their contributions to the reproduction of the labour force. And importantly, it cheapened the value of labour power as well. And so since the 1980s, the failure of the wage to liberate women has become clear, but the social reproductive role has been so naturalised and invisibilised throughout society that instead of fighting to degender and socialise care to fight against an overall system of capitalist patriarchy, some women have sought a return to an idealised housewife lifestyle.
My early 20s, I was the typical career girl. You know, I went to London, I was working long hours. People crave that sense of belonging and home and quaintness and all the traditional aspects.
If I'm already working for a wage and doing housework, why the fuck should I work? And the most extreme and obviously fascistic form of this tendency is obviously the trad wife phenomenon, but the variant that can be most clearly understood as a mirror of the manosphere is the one that views a return of the housewife as a kind of entrepreneurial gamble, where your relationship to men is mediated through a sexual market value, one which directly uses manosphere language, like taking the red pill or indeed taking the pink pill, one that has erupted as a manifestation of extreme misogyny that is, yes, embedded in the very foundations of modern neoliberal capitalism. And finally, as my friend Elle again points out, the social reaction to these post-feminists seeking sanctuary in the patriarchal homestead has been far more understanding than the horrid, blue-haired feminists. So, on the one hand, we have a vision of the pink pill. I know it's kind of like salmon orangey. It's an iron tablet. Shocker, I need iron tablets. It's the best I could do. We have a vision of the pink pill as a group of post-feminist entrepreneurs of the self, using their sexual market value to realise their goals of returning to a traditional gender dynamic. And on the other, we have the pink pill of some left-wing women who, within a pervasive atmosphere of violence, perhaps have a generally negative view of men and understand feminism as an all-encompassing commitment to radical politics. I don't know, might have blue hair as well. One of these things is a real worry. The article wants you to convince you that it's the young women who are troubled by misogyny, who hold left-wing opinions, that are just as bad as Andrew Tate. Their silly little pink pill will ruin relations between the genders, and they just need to grow up. Of course, it doesn't want to be held to such gauche arguments, so it instead make a series of patronising insinuations, never explicitly saying much at all, but always implying that taking this pink pill is just as bad as taking the red one. But I know which pink pill I'm taking. I fucking hate men. And Britain.
Alright, thanks for watching. As ever, this video and this channel wouldn't survive without the support of my beautiful audience, beautiful patrons, whose names I will read out in just a second. But if you have enjoyed this video and you feel like you want to support the channel, please do consider becoming a patron. From just $2 a month, you get early access to videos, you get all the scripts, you get a bank of all of my writing, basically. $5 and up get access to a Discord server, and $10 and up get their names read out in the credits. If you don't feel like you can support at Patreon at this stage, I also have a tip jar via PayPal and Ko-fi, and all of that is in the description. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a oh God, it took it out of me, like, writing this. I think there was just so much to deal with and correct, and so much of it is written in that tone of implication rather than argument, which means everything that you're doing in response has to be quite tight. I almost didn't go to a party because I was busy writing this. I'm glad I went to the party. That was a good idea to go to the party. Here's a lesson for everyone. Rather than writing response videos to New Statesman articles, go to parties. But yeah, I hope you all like this. Next video is going to be out soon as well. It's going to be on Palantir and how they're supervillains. And if you want, again, early access to that, consider becoming a patron. And on that note, I will read out the names of my $10 and up patrons. We have Demo Squid, Sovel Hayes, Anita Anisby, Bonbon, Cameron Blakemore, Daniel Swing, Earl Grey T, Ellis Wren, FD Signifier, Hey Joe, Joshua Moldenhauer, Katie Marshall, Kim Crawley, Nina G Public Relations, Unoriginal Name, Violet, Ghost, Aaron, Alex, Borland Rice, Kedesware, Christopher Poff, Daniel Hughes, Duncan Skinner, Esoteric Fictionalism, Eugene K, J. Fraser Cartwright, Jack, Jacob Quinn Schenker, Joel, J.R. Barbera, Caspar Gunda Westbarg Lerson, Kieran Gore, Layum, Mason Colbert, Melanie Estes, Mark Gussie, Niels Abelgard, Paul Singleton, Phil Westfall, Piratical Woman, Rachel Ann, Rachel Mixon, Robin, Tamash Kispeter, TB Skyen, Tim, Tinfoil Pancakes, Tom Price, and Xander Carvis. Oh, I'm getting good at reeling off those names. One day I'm going to do it perfect. Which is not to say that anyone wants to do a $10 and up patron shouldn't do it. Just please do it. I will slot your name into the waterfall of names that I'm getting increasingly good at reeling off. But on that note, thanks again for watching, and I love you. Bye.
I will take my second iron pill though.